I'm really excited for this module as we're really kicking off the lesson planning project. And so just know that everything we do in the next 4 or 5 modules is going to lead up to the largest assignment that you do in this class, which is your lesson plan project. So for lesson planning, we are going to be using the backward design model. So I wanted to ask you, have you ever been in a class and you take, for example, like the exam or the final exam, and you're thinking to yourself, we didn't learn anything on this exam. Like, I don't understand why I'm being tested on this. We didn't learn about it. That instructor was probably using the traditional model of lesson planning, and that's where you identify your objectives, you plan your learning activities or how you're going to teach it, and then they come up with the assessment or the exam at the end. This is not the most effective way of lesson planning. Backward design model, which is what we're going to be using, is we're going to be looking we're going to begin with the end in mind. So it's really deciding what do you want your students to know at the end, and then working your way backwards. Let's decide what we want them to know. Let's plan the assessment that we're going to use at the end. And then last but not least, let's plan how we're going to teach those lessons. So to give you a little bit more in terms of the backward design model, these are the 3 steps. And so we're starting with step 1 in this module, which is determining your learning goals and objectives. What is it that you want your students to know? Step 2, which is what we'll do next module, which is how are we going to plan those assessments? What are those assessments going to look like? And then step 3 is what we'll be doing for about the next 2 or 3 modules after that, is how do we come up with learning activities? How do we actually teach that content? Now that we know what we want them to discover by the end, how are we going to teach it? And so that way we ensure that everything that's on that assessment we have taught during that lesson or that unit. What do we use as teachers in North Carolina? We use the North Carolina Standard Course of Study to determine our goals, our objectives, and our assessments. And so understanding the North Carolina Standard Course of Study will really help you to make effective lesson planning. Also, we want to make sure we're using this Standard Course of Study because those statewide assessments that are given are based upon this course of study. It provides equity and consistency, so if students are switching school systems, we're all teaching the same thing. And for you as a teacher, it's very helpful in determining the pacing of your instruction. Also helps you in determining like instructional time. So how much time should I be spending on each objective? Speaking of objectives, you're going to be developing this module both goals and objectives. So I wanted to stop for a minute and talk about the differences between writing a goal and writing an objective. When you write a goal for a lesson, goals are more broad. They are very broad-based. They may take the span of an entire unit, whereas an objective may cover a specific lesson. So time frame is how they're different. Also, objectives should be measurable. So I can create an assessment off that specific objective, and I can measure that a student understands and knows that objective. Whereas a goal, again, is more broad-based, and so you may not be specific enough to be able to measure it. But both provide a foundation of what your instruction is going to look like and what your assessment is going to look like. So I want to show you an example. When you create a goal, again, they should describe the overall learning outcome without being too specific. It's going to probably expand a larger period of time, so an entire unit. Typically, when you take something like a final exam, that's what's measuring your goal. You do want to make sure your goal is aligned with the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. So just an example I've given you over there on the right-hand side. I chose 7th grade math. That is where I got my start. And so this particular standard is talking about area and circumference of a circle, so you can read that standard there. So if I was creating a goal around that standard, students will understand the properties of circles and how to apply mathematical formulas to solve problems involving area and circumference. Very broad, very large. Goals are large. It's not something that I can teach in the span of one lesson. There's just no way. But this goal provides this big framework for this unit that I'm probably working on circles. And so again, this could span a matter of days, weeks, months, but it's a large, broad goal. Now, if I'm coming up with objectives for a specific unit, I'm going to take that large goal and I'm going to pick out specific skills or knowledge that I expect those students to know by the end of that lesson. You want to make sure you're using action verbs when you're coming up with your objectives. So notice that example over there on the right hand side. It starts off with words like define, derive, explain, solve. I would definitely go back to what we were doing with Bloom's taxonomy. So notice there's a bit of a hierarchy of things. Like first I want you to start with define, and then I want you to move in and I want you to drive and apply. And then I want you to be able to explain your understanding or your learning. And then I want you to be able to solve. Again, you want to make sure that these objectives are aligned with the standard course of study. Notice when you read my examples over there on the right hand side, they are measurable. So I can give some type of assessment. We'll talk about assessment next week. We're not trying to do everything at one time. But notice I could give some type of assessment and measure whether or not students have met those specific objectives. And then finally, the last thing that you're going to be creating for stage 1 of your lesson plan are what we call essential questions. Those are questions that kind of guide your instruction for that lesson. These are questions that students should be able to answer. So you always want to think to yourself when you create these, by the end of this lesson, I want students, if I ask these questions, I want students to be able to answer them by the end of the lesson. So some questions that I could pose to my students based upon those objectives that I just showed you. What is circumference? How is it related to radius and diameter of a circle? How can we use circumference, the formula, to solve real-world problems? And then how does changing the radius or the diameter of that circle affect its circumference? Again, these questions should guide your instruction. So again, we're starting with the end in mind. So here's my questions. Now, later on, I'm going to come up with my instruction, and I want to make sure that what I'm teaching, my students are going to be able to answer these questions. With that being said, let's take a look at the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, and let's take a look at the assignments that you're going to be doing for this module. Alright, so right here in this module, right below this video, I've provided you a lot of resources to start exploring the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. So one of your assignments for this week, I want you to upload the standards for your desired grade level and subject area. So I want to make sure that you know how to locate them. I would suggest starting with this first link, which is the search engine for the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. So right here, this is where the search engine is going to bring you. You can filter it by grade level. So for me, again, I'm middle school, so I'm going to choose middle. For document type, I want you to upload the standards document. Now, I do want to mention the unpacking documents they are very beneficial. So what they do for the unpacking documents, which I would encourage you to look at them, is they take the standards and then they break it down. They provide examples of questions that it feels like you should give students in class to master that particular objective or standard. So I would encourage you to look at the unpacking document. But for this assignment, I'm requiring you to upload the standards. So at minimum, look at the standards. So I'm going to choose standards, and then I'm just going to hit search. That's going to bring up the standards for all middle grades, so all subject areas. I'm just going to choose the K-8 math standard, so I'm going to open that up here, and then it's going to provide me this PDF document. This is what I'm going to want you to save and upload as part of that assignment. So no, you don't have to choose middle school. No, you don't have to choose math. I want you to choose your specific grade level and specific subject area. Now, if you are interested in elementary, of course, elementary, you're teaching every subject. So just choose one. So if you want to just choose language arts or math or science or, social studies, whatever subject you want to choose is fine. And so just to show you what it looks like here, now this particular document is K-8, so it's going to go kindergarten through 8th grade. I'm going to just show you, for example, here's 6th grade. And a standard is this right here. This would be my first standard, understand the concept of ratio to use, or excuse me, understand the concept of a ratio and use ratio language to do what? So right here is going to be my first standard, and you can see how these standards progress throughout. So this would be my entire 6th grade math. This is what I would expect those students to be able to master by the end of 6th grade math. So again, I want you to download it and upload it. Now, some other resources I've given you here. The second link is they are reference guides. So if you are teaching elementary school, if you go down to the bottom of this page, it's going to give you the entire grade level. So this is kind of beneficial to you if you want to see the big picture of everything, because it's going to cover health standards, math standards, ELA, science, social studies. And so you can choose, if you want to upload the reference guide rather than a specific subject area, I'm completely fine with that, because again, it gives you the big picture of that entire grade level. Now, I do want you to know that the Department of Public Instruction has released so many references and resources out there for teachers to be able to use to help unpack these standards and understand them, and what are some examples that I can use, what are some assessments that I can use. Now, granted, you don't have to look at these, but if you kind of want to go ahead and get a jump start on understanding these standards, I provide you the resources that are provided by the Department of Public Instruction. So for example, this is the language arts page, so it's going to give you instructional strategies, resources, professional learning, an implementation kit, just some really great resources. You might want to just go ahead and bookmark these on your computer. So throughout your time in the College of Education, you can go and reference them. So I provided you the math one, the science one, and the social studies link here. So I would encourage you to go ahead and start looking at them, but at minimum, what I'm expecting you to do here, find your standards document, download it to your computer. So you can see here for your assignment, I want you to upload that standards document. And then I want you, there's a text box right below where you upload the document. I want you to answer these 3 questions here. Basically, I want to see some observations that you've made from looking over this document. How do you think you're going to approach teaching these standards? And then what kind of challenges do you anticipate having? Or do you have any questions after you've read this document that you feel like maybe I could help you with answering? And then last but not least, this assignment is going to kickstart the lesson planning process. So you're going to do stage 1 of backward design. So I've provided a template here for you. I'll show you here. You're going to come up with just the first part of a lesson. So give me a lesson title. What standard does that lesson relate to? So that's going to pull from the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. I want you to develop a goal or goals. It can be multiple goals for that lesson. Now, this particular goal, that might not be covered in that lesson. It might be a goal that's covered over an entire unit, but it relates to that lesson that you're teaching. What kind of essential questions are you going to ask in this lesson? And then what objectives should students meet? So I think it's best to show you an example, and I've been showing you the example throughout this video here. But this would be the start of a lesson that I do on exploring circumference. So here's the standard from 7th grade math, what they're expected to know in that standard. Notice I'm not teaching that entire standard in this lesson. There's no way. So I just chose circumference. And then this is the goal of that entire unit. So that goal covers, properties of circles. How do we apply formulas? How do we solve problems involving area and circumference? Again, though, this particular lesson is just on exploring circumference. So the objectives, this is what I want students to know by the end of that lesson. I want you to define circumference. I want you to derive and apply the formulas. I want you to explain the meaning of pi, why it's used in the circumference calculation. And then I want those students to solve real-world problems. And then these are the essential questions that I expect that students should be able to answer by the end of that lesson. If you have any questions at all about how to kickstart, a lesson, how do we develop those goals, objectives, and essential questions, or if you have any questions about your standard course of study, do not hesitate to reach out to me.